Check 1 2, check 1 2, check 1 2, check 1 2, test 1 2, check 1 2. No, check. Check 1 2, check 1 2, check. Check 1 2, check 1 2, check 1 2, check 1 2, check 1 2. Are you hearing this at all? Yeah? Test 1 2. Should be a line level signal coming in to you. Check 1 2, 1 2, 1 2, 1 2, 1 2. Check 1 2. Check, check.
No, I just want to make sure that you have, okay. Good evening. It is good to see us back in this space. The last time we were here was 2019 for the co-lecture of that year. My name is Emily Towns, and I'm Dean of the Vanderbilt Divinity School. On behalf of the Divinity School and the university, welcome to this year's co-lecture. This lectureship was established in 1893 by Colonel E.W. Cole of Nashville to bring distinguished lecturers to the campus in, quote, defense and advocacy of the Christian religion, close quote. As we have now turned fully into the 21st century, we are broadening this once again to include engagement, conversation, and even shared deliberation that Christian traditions might share with other faith traditions. Among the distinguished church leaders and theologians who have delivered the co-lectures over the past 129 years are Harry Emerson Fosdick, Paul Tillich, H. Richard Niebuhr, Fred Craddock, Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza, Albert Rapito, Gustavo Gutierrez, James Cone, Don Beiswinger, Ed Farley, David Buttrick, Jürgen Moltmann, Peter Gomes, Jim Wallace, James Lawson, Elaine Pagels, Nikki Finney, Daisy Machado, and Gary Dorian. This year's co-lecturer is Francis X. Clooney, S.J., who is the Parkman Professor of Divinity and Professor of Comparative Theology at Harvard Divinity School. He joined that faculty in 2005. After earning his doctorate in South Asian languages and civilizations at the University of Chicago in 1984, he taught at Boston College for 21 years before coming to Harvard. From 2010 to 2017, he was the director of the Center for the Study of World Religions at Harvard. His primary areas of Indological scholarship are theological commentarial writings in the Sanskrit and Tamil traditions of Hindu India. He is also a leading figure globally in the developing field of comparative theology, a discipline distinguished by attentiveness to the dynamics of theological learning deepened through the study of traditions other than one's own. He has also written on the Jesuit missionary tradition, particularly in India, on the early Jesuit Pan-Asian discourse on reincarnation, and on the dynamics of dialogue and interreligious learning in the contemporary world. Clooney is the author of numerous articles and books spanning from the 1980s to the present. His recent books include Reading the Hindu and Christian Classics, Why and How It Matters, Western Jesuit Scholars in India, Tracing Their Paths, Reassessing Their Goals, and St. Joseph in South India, Poetry, Mission, and Theology, in Costanzo Gioseffo Besci's Tempava. His translation of the Hindu theologian Ramanuja's Manual of Daily Worship appeared in the International Journal of Hindu Studies in 2020. He is currently writing, among his other projects, an intellectual autobiography tentatively entitled Priest and Scholar, Catholic and Hindu, a Love Story. He is currently president of the Catholic Theological Society of America. In July 2010, he was elected a Fellow of the British Academy and has served as a Professorial Research Fellow in the Australian Catholic University. His most recent, and notice I say recent, honorary doctorate was awarded in November 2019 by Regis College of the University of Toronto. Clooney is a Roman Catholic priest and has been a member of the Society of Jesus for 50 years and serves regularly in a Catholic parish on weekends. Tonight, his lecture, Hindu Poetry and Christian Particularity, Translation, Disruption, Revelation, draws on his many years of attempting to translate the poetry of Hindu saints known as the alvars, those immersed in God. After the lecture and a question and answer period, we invite you to join us in a reception in the reading room that's easiest to get to if you go this way out the doors and hang a left. Please join me in welcoming Professor Frank Clooney to the Divinity School for the first time and to Vanderbilt University for the first time. Frank, the floor is yours.
I would like to begin by thanking you for coming tonight to this lecture, the Cole Lecture, and by expressing my own gratitude and great sense of being honored by being invited to give such a prestigious lecture and to be part of this lineage of wonderful scholars who have been here over the years. I appreciate Dean Towns' kind introduction and will try to live up to it in the course of my presentation to you tonight. And I promise to go about 50 minutes only, and then we'll have time for some Q&A. I started studying Tamil poetry from the South Indian section of India known as Tamil Nadu around 1980, 1981. And I have here up on the screen, it's not an eye test, and I will read to you verses that are on the screen as we go along. A verse that was one of the first that struck me over 40 years ago, approximately in 1981. I'll read the Tamil first. I don't read Tamil very well, but just to show I can do it, I'll read the Tamil of the first one. Indraha nalayaha, insiridham nindraha, nin arul yen palade, nandraha nan une undri ilain, kandai, narayanen ni enai undri ilay. Today and tomorrow and then a little longer, your grace is all I have. Surely, without you, I am not. But see, Narayana, without me, you are not. And right from the start, a verse like this caught my attention. I was plodding through, looking up every word, trying to figure out what the Tamil meant. And suddenly it popped out at me that while the first few lines are fairly straightforward, and one can find parallels easily in the Christian tradition, in the Hebrew Bible, in the Psalms, for instance, your grace is all I have, O Lord, without you I am not. I was kind of thrown back, I remember in 1981, by the final part. But you, Narayana, you, Lord, without me, you are not. And I found myself beginning to be intrigued and drawn into a world that was in one level devotional and one level like something I had grown up with, but on another level given to daring and unexpected statements that were different from those of my own Catholic Christian tradition. I began to look around and read other verses. And I'll just read you these verses, just for example, how other verses that show the Lord and the self coming together in unpredicted ways. Beyond thought is that peerless one. By his grace I placed him in my mind to hold him there, but that too is his sweet grace. And then he makes me realize all mind, all breath, all body, the infinite too, are nothing. In the end, he ended up as me himself. He ended up as me himself before everything and everyone. himself the peerless first one, expanding himself as Shiva, Brahma, and himself. He abides in my body, my breath, my mind, as sweet as honey, milk, sugarcane, ambrosia. On him I meditate. And clearly the poet, a mystic poet from the 9th century, begins to understand that to understand who God is to see yourself as, in a sense, a part of the reality of God, but like different liquids, sweet liquids like the honey, the milk, the sugarcane, beginning to mix with one another to become one reality. You can still speak to God as other, as you, but nonetheless begin to realize that separation from God is not really the way forward. So I became more intrigued by this poetry the more I read of it. I'll give you one more example as we get started. When I began teaching at Boston College in 1984, I put together a new course called Holy Men and Women of India. And realizing I didn't have enough material, I started scrambling and looking for things to add to the course, and found a Tamil language biography of the woman saint among these Tamil saints named Andal. And in the midst of it, she announces to her family and to the people of the town that she is going to marry Lord Vishnu. She doesn't simply want to be a devotee, but she wants to marry the Lord and become one with the Lord. And they basically tell her, it's preposterous. You cannot do that. You can have sentiments in your heart, but of course it cannot be taken literally. You are not the bride. God is not the bridegroom. And she gives this verse, which I'll read to you. The Lord can, in fact, do what we hope the Lord will do. And so she sings actually, whichever form pleases his people, that is his form. Whichever name pleases his people, that is his name. Whichever color pleases his people, who think upon this unwearying, that is his color, he who holds the discus. Now, in some ways, this conformed to what I had always thought about Hinduism, even when I was much younger, before studying Tamil, a quite capacious, accommodating tradition in which one is able to see and to understand how God is as you call God to be. You can see God in a way that conforms to your desire to see. God takes the form, God speaks in the language that you are accustomed to. God is far, God is distant, God is perfect, but God is as close and simple as you imagine God to be in your own heart. This verse struck me as beautiful. I learned later that it was not actually a verse of this saint, but of another saint of the same time period. But put into our mouth, it kind of pushed back and said the ability to imagine that you could be a bride-bridegroom relationship with the Lord is quite possible, because as you wish, the Lord will be for you. The Lord can be your bridegroom, the Lord can be your bride if you wish. And I was intrigued by this because I realized I was beginning to get into something that opened up in all kinds of directions. I found in commentaries, for instance, on the verse I just read about his name, his form, his color, directions about how this relates to temple worship. And it relates to temple worship basically simply by saying, in the temple, we don't really think. We don't imagine that God is this stone or that stone. But God is presented in beautiful forms that we can imagine, we can see for ourselves, in ways that are attractive to us, that please our seeing, our hearing, our smelling, our tasting. And so here, a verse from the Bhagavad Gita, however someone takes refuge in me, in that way do I favor them, O Partha. And verses from an older text about ritual instructions, the lovely form of Vishnu, his image, his pleasing face and gaze. Let him make an image in a way that pleases him, from gold or silver, and then he should honor it and bow down before it, love it, meditate on it. Purified of floors, he will then reach that very form of Brahman as he imagines. Or again, another text is quoted in this ancient commentary, whichever form pleases his people, take that form, the verse I read. That is, the Lord takes for himself that form which devotees imagine as his divine body. He makes himself present in any material devotees choose, be it gold or silver or stone. For there is no rule which limits times or places or forms in any established way. The Lord overlooks the shortcomings of his devotees and comes as they wish. So the more I read this poetry, the more I began to understand it. I began to be fascinated by these saints and by their poetry. This is almost impossible to see, but this is a picture of the 12 alvar saints. The alvars are saints from approximately the 7th to 10th century in South India, writing in the Tamil language, not the Sanskrit language, but in traditional Tamil. And there are, up on the screen, I won't try to point them out one by one, but there are 11 male saints from the highest caste to the lowest caste, and one woman saint, Andal, whose verse I referred to a moment ago. And this collection of these saints over this 2 or 3 century period composed about 4,000 verses in Tamil, comprised in about 25 different works. And they were collected by the 10th century, by the 11th century or so, and passed down as a canon of sacred text. And I realized that as I began by reading 1 or 2 verses, as I read to you as I began, that in fact I was entering a world of scripture, a world of sacred text, a world in which I could not simply say, I'll just read this part or that part, but I was brought up into it in various closer ways, seeing this array of saints and the poetry that was theirs. One more example. I was finding myself in some of the poetry immediately accessible, immediately beautiful, immediately attractive to me. And then I found in the course of one of these works, called the Holy Drama, or in Tamil, the Tiruvrittam, a verse that seems to speak of he and she, the Lord and the soul as lovers to one another. And at first I had found traditional translations of the verse, and I give you one on the screen by Kaushalya Hart, a professor retired from Berkeley. He says, her face is like a lotus, her eyes are like beautiful kendai fish or sharp spears, her nose is like a vine, and she wears earrings in her ears. But when our eyes met, we felt as if we had drunk the nectar from the milky ocean churned up by the gods. No one will gossip about us. Our love is true. So I found the verse interesting, and I found this rendering of it quite clear by Kaushalya Hart. But then to my dismay, I went and looked at the verse itself. And when I looked at the verse itself, I realized how much less it said than Kaushalya Hart put in her translation. I think she was bending over backwards to try to make it accessible to people who didn't know Tamil. But if you can see this next slide, I have at the top her translation, which I just read to you. And then I have at the bottom a more literal translation, which I worked on a couple of years ago in writing an essay. In the lotus where the senses circle, kendai fish make war, held apart by a single creeper. But still they dart about, piercing like spears. Like ocean waves that gush ambrosia when churned by Krishna's hand, I have been churned. Had you seen, you would no longer scold me. It's quite different, quite spare, quite simple, and actually deliberately, I think, a bit puzzling, because the point is, by the end of it, as the man speaks to his friend about the woman apparently that he is in love with, if you haven't seen it, you don't really understand what's being talked about. The first part doesn't talk about her ears, her eyes, her necklace, her earrings, her nose, and so on, but simply a lotus, kendai fish, a creeper. It could be a scene at a pond out in the countryside. And it's deliberately inscrutable, I think taunting, in a sense playing with the reader, saying, see, you don't really know what I'm talking about. And the latter part takes an old myth of the churning of the ocean, where in very ancient Indian literature, there is this story of the gods and the demons, the suras and asuras. They churn the ocean. They have a mountain as a churning stick and a serpent that pulls it back and forth, and they churn out of the ocean the poison that might destroy the universe, that needs to be drunk by the god Shiva to prevent the world being destroyed. And then the ambrosia of life, which is also the goddess Lakshmi that arises from the ocean. This verse takes that myth and changes it by saying, I too have been churned. I've been churned, but not by the gods, but by the hand of Krishna, Lord Krishna. Krishna comes in and reaches in me and like pulls in my guts and is stirring me up. I'm totally turned around inside, and again, we don't really know what he is saying to his friend. And it simply ends, as you can see, had you seen, you would no longer scold me. And apparently the point, for we learn from the later commentaries and so on, is that he's infatuated by this woman that he loves. He can't think of anyone else. And the friend is sort of saying, get over it. Relationships come and go. You love this one, you love that one, you move on, you forget them, and you have a new one. And he's saying in his own kind of obscure language, don't you understand? I've been totally transformed. And as with the Song of Songs in the Bible, then this is transposed onto the level of divine human love. And what struck me in this is that some of the verses are immediate. Some puzzle by saying, Lord, you are not existent without me. Some are very clear and simple. Whatever form you take, I will take that form for you. And some like this are meant to puzzle the mind and confound the mind in order to make it clear that we don't really understand the divine mysteries that we are becoming part of. Reading this poetry over time and puzzling over translations and getting deeper into it, I also learned that this poetry has a very specific form. Not all the poems, but a large number of them are in the style that is known as the Undadi style. And here, although it's in Tamil, it's using Sanskrit words, the word anta, end, and then adi, meaning beginning. And the poetry is in the form that the last word or sound in each verse is the first word or sound of the next verse. And that the verses are kind of strung together in a kind of garland, as they say, a garland of flowers or a necklace of pearls. They're in a certain order, and every verse is sort of playing with a theme or a notion or an image, linked even if you cannot understand why to the next verse. So you can't really just choose and pick which ones you like to read, because they're all linked to one another. 100 verses in this style, another 100 verses, another 100 verses. And I think what I found in this is that you are being encouraged as a reader not to pick out simply the verses that you like or the verses that you understand best, but to be caught up in the process of reading around the circle. You go around and around and around. And the same themes, maybe 10, 12, 15 mythological themes come up again and again and again. And the point seems to be that as you go around this circle, this garland of texts, you're entering more and more deeply into the poetry. You're beginning to see again and again the images of divine intervention in the world, love for the divine, mystical union, the fact that the Lord is beyond imagination. You get to the end, and then you start over again. I give you one example here on the screen of the poet that I started with, who has the verse about Narayana, you are not without me. Here in the last verse of this entire work, it ends with saying, you are all that will be known, you are all good actions, Narayana, all this I know well. And the word for I in Tamil is nan. Flip back to the beginning, to the first verse, the four-faced God created by Narayana, Shiva himself created by Brahma, the foremost four-faced God. Foremost myself, by these linked verses I make known this deep meaning, meditate on them without questioning, and accept them. And the trick here is that the word nan comes up again, but it doesn't mean I. And so I put in brackets, if you can see the screen, four-faced God, the word for four in Tamil is nal, or in compound nan. And so you start, the last verse ends in nan, and the first verse begins in nan. And you go back and forth in the circle. And I think this is interesting again because it's instructing you on how to read this poetry. You can't pick and choose and do it in your own way, but you're being drawn into it. And you may start by picking verses that you favor, but after a while you realize you're being asked to make a much larger commitment. And so looking at this, and then I came up with a chart of the approximately 1,585 verses, to be exact actually, not approximate, written in this style of beginning and end linking, the same myths being repeated, all these small, always four-line verses spread out over a number of poets. If you can see on the screen, Poigai alvar, But alvar, Pe alvar, all of them have stories connected with them, who they are, each one writing 100 verses, to the Maurice Perron, whose poetry I read starting at the beginning, 96 verses in his text. And the third one, this one known as Nam Alvar, whose verses I read a little while ago also, in one of his works, only 87 verses and not a full 100 for some reason. And then another work, the most large, the greatest of these works, 1,102 verses. And they're all in this circular pattern. And I found that thinking about this and reading it, it's really asking you to become part of this, not to read it and move on, but to meditate and find yourself within it. And it began to be actually too much. You start reading a few innocent verses and you find yourself suddenly being asked to comprehend an entire religious universe and to become part of it. I give you some examples. I'll only read, I think, the third one of the three, where this poet Nam Alvar in his poetry is telling you, if you stick with this, what will you get from it? If you learn perfectly these 10 verses from the 1,000 metered by feet, the feet of the Lord, but also the metrical feet, the humble service of Shatakopan or Nam Alvar of southern Kurahur, about the tall one who once graced the 5 and uprooted the 100, a reference to the famous Bhagavad Gita, you will end up with no more births. Promising that this is a way to salvation. Going around endlessly in this circle of verses, ironically, is enabling you to get out of the circle of births and to not come back into it. And again, the poets promise, if you do this properly, you will be drawn in very deeply. Back for a moment to the woman poet Andal, whose work I referred to briefly earlier. I give the last verse of one of her works. It's not in the Andari style, but it seems to capture some of this demand that we be transformed by what we read. The turbulent ocean was churned by Krishna, Krishna who puts his hand in and churns you inside, whom the cowherd women, the gopis, adorned with beautiful jewels, faces bright as the moon, approached and worshipped. In this way, they gained their wished-for parai drum. So the women in the verses dance with Krishna, belong to Krishna. They find their love, the meaning of their lives with Lord Krishna. And about all of that, Andal, the poet, daughter of the Lord and priest of beautiful Pudavai, who wore a garland of pure, cool lotuses, sang this bouquet of 30 Tamil verses. Her own bouquet, 30 verses that go around and around. That somehow she takes up the story of those women who danced with Krishna, and she puts it together in her own poetry, and it becomes real for her in the poetry. And so finally, in the final part of this very long verse, actually, so people here and now who recite her 30 verses, skipping none of them, will surely receive from our beloved Tirumal, or Krishna, whose eyes and face are radiant, whose 4 shoulders are dark mountains, is everywhere grace and joy forever. And I quote this one at length because I think it's a beautiful instance of multi-layers within the tradition. The original story, the ancient myth of Krishna and the cowherd girls, the poet who sings of it and brings it to life in her time and place, and then asking readers, reciters, people who memorize the verse. Even today, you can go on YouTube and find these verses being sung. Somehow you make it your own. And if you make it your own, you enter into the world of Andal, the poet, who had entered into the world of the cowherd women. You gain his everywhere grace, and you gain joy forever. That's part one of my talk. Getting involved in this poetry, going deep into it, beginning to realize what the poetry is like. I'm sorry, I'm not remembering to move this forward. I have to remember more. Sorry about that. I have to keep both parts of my mind working at the same time. When I took up the project of translating some of this poetry recently to do these original small 100-verse works that go in circles, I was thinking that this would be a fairly quick task. I could publish it and it would be done in this Morty Classical Library that Harvard is publishing now. But I began to find that it's all too much, that it asks a lot of you, it becomes complicated. You do the verses and then you begin to spread out from the verses in different directions. You become overwhelmed by the possibilities. And then the nasty kind of insidious question that bothers many a scholar, I think, comes into play: who cares? Who will read these lovely translations? who will bother with them in any way like the poet, the author who's slaving over the translations and doing this kind of work. But I think for a very long time, the human race has been collecting works and making them accessible in new languages. Think of all the translations of the Bible into so many different languages. Thinking of collecting the books of the Bible into one text. But in more modern times, you think of like the Loeb classics, the Greek and Latin classics, the Greek and Latin on one side, the English translation on the other side, those red and green covers spreading out rows and rows of books. Beautifully done, wonderfully done. Who reads them? Who are they for? Well, the sacred books of the East, Max Muller, the great Oxford professor in the 19th century, decided to try to introduce the classics of the rest of the world to the European and American minds by saying, you talk about these religions positively or negatively, but apparently you don't know anything about them. So let me try to rectify that. And in 50 volumes, a quite impressive set of volumes, translating some of the sacred text of the different traditions and putting them forward, somewhere between like 1870 and 1900, 50 volumes come out of the sacred books. Or at Harvard, where I am, the Harvard Oriental series probably has 100+ volumes now of all these wonderful translations of texts that go way, way back. Who are the readers for these texts? And you could go on and on. Translations of the Chinese classics, the Rig Veda, the most ancient of Indian texts, came out in 3 fat volumes, about 2,000 pages a few years ago, a beautiful new translation. New renderings, not translations, but renderings of the Quran with notes and ample explanation. The Mishnah, the Babylonian Talmud, and on these collections, the works of St. Augustine and so on. All of these things are being made available. And what has always worried me is, do we have readers for these texts? And so here we have, these are some volumes of the Morty Classical Library, which is growing and growing. And if I finish my project and get it into good form, it'll be probably like, volume 27 or volume 32 in this series. And I began to think about this and say, what kind of people do we need to be? Or what kind of a human race do we need to be that we can somehow have, understand, appreciate, receive, and live up to the very high standards of these texts? So not simply say, let's get them for the library, and then every few years dust them off and make sure they're still there. But rather, these texts are asking something of us. And are we really in a world where that is possible for us to continue? Of course, the easiest traditional way was to say there is one canon only, and the one canon is the one we go to. The other books, you can leave them out if you want to. So the canon could be the Old Testament, New Testament, or the Quran, or the Rig Veda. And I think many people in human history, partly because of deep faith and conviction and sometimes contempt for the other, have narrowed themselves down to a single body of text and said, we will spend the rest of history interpreting, coming out with new commentaries, new translations, new editions of the same books again and again. Other people say, that's all I can bear. I can't possibly go and understand everything else. I can't possibly read the Chinese classics and the Indian classics and Arab classics and Persian classics and classics from African tradition or other parts of the world. I can't do that. And so we just leave them behind. Or simply say, in a way that may sound good but perhaps not mean anything, we have multiple canons. We used to have in the West the Greek and Latin classics, the fathers of the church, but before that, Plato and Aristotle, the plays of Euripides and so on, Cicero and Virgil and Horace and so on, works that were the classics. But we all know that classics departments are under great stress today and things have kind of burst open because nobody can really agree anymore on what the classics are or how to have classical literature anymore. And I think in some ways it leaves it like at a great supermarket or a great buffet where you dip into it and you find the text you want. And after a while, there are a few people in the world who read the Tamil classics, or fewer and fewer people like me who translate them, and a few people do that canon, that canon, that canon. And the whole thing is kind of up for grabs, and the canon does not have any power in our culture. And I think we could talk about this later, but whether or not in the 21st century, in our diverse societies, our diverse world, could we possibly agree on 100 books that everyone should read? Or could we agree on a set of sacred scriptures that all people would go to? And you can have in an interfaith chapel easily a nice bookcase with different books. But are there people to read them? Do we have seminaries to teach them? Do we have students to study them, professors to share them with their students? I'm very skeptical of this. And how does it come about that we begin to recover this literature and make something of it without, again, getting lost in this overwhelming mass of texts that pile up on the screen and elsewhere? And then, should we bother? I mean, every day when I try to translate several verses a day until I get this project done, and it takes any time from 10 minutes to 45 minutes or an hour to figure out what several verses are saying. And then I read, as I do every morning, the New York Times, and see, in every page there's a new horror. Climate degradation, racial prejudice, war in Ukraine, drought and disaster in certain parts of the world, trouble in our cities, the gap between rich and poor growing. Like, who cares? What good is Tamil poetry or Chinese poetry or Arabic poetry, whatever? Do these things matter? And I'll come back to that point at the end because it's a different one. But in part 3 of my lecture, there are 4 parts, don't worry, it's not 10 parts. In part 3, I'd like to offer some strategies about how I think one could begin to learn from and appreciate this Tamil poetry, which I put before you, the 1,500 verses of these verses that go in circles and want to draw you in. And I put them forward as strategies, each one okay, but none of them in themselves enough, perhaps until we get to the end. The first is to do what I've done for you tonight. So look at the poetry, say, all right, there are about 1,500 verses in this style, and I'll put 3 of them, maybe 5 of them up on the screen, and everybody can take them away, and everybody will have some sense of what this poetry is about, and it's very beautiful, even in translation, and leave it at that. That can be done. The problem with that is, and in terms of the first part of my lecture, that sort of gives us power over the poetry. We're not submitting ourselves to the revelation, the poetry, the vision of the author, but rather we are saying, I'll pick that one and that one and that one, and then I'll pick something from North India, and then I'll pick something from China, and then I'll pick something from Ireland, and I'll pick this and that. We are in charge. And I think after a while that should begin to break down, because none of the poets involved really have a vision that it can be done so easily and cheaply, in and out, quickly. The second is to do comparisons. And what I have up on here on the screen, I'm a comparativist. I love to put things in 2 columns and read them together. Do comparisons because you can bring something from another tradition to your home tradition. Just as when you travel around the world, you may buy an interesting object, a beautiful work of art, a statue, a tapestry, a rug or something like that, and bring it home with you. You can go to another tradition and bring something back with you. So the verse I started with, surely without you I am not, but see Narayana, without me you are not. And I started racking my brains and said, if I started to do a comparison, which I will only, this is it, tonight, I will not go into it any more deeply, where to go? And I, as many of us might think in this, say, Meister Eckhart. Come with Meister Eckhart and find something in his abundant writings. And I found, skimming through his works, which I am by no means a master of, a passage in which he seems to say that the relationship between God and the human is a very fluid one. While I yet stood in my first cause, I had no God. I was my own cause. Then I wanted nothing and desired nothing, for I was bare being and the knower of myself in the enjoyment of truth. For before there were creatures, God was not God. He was that which he was. But when creatures came into existence and received their created being, then God was not God in himself, he was God in creatures. Which in some interesting way begins to shed light on the Tamil poetry. Does Meister Eckhart in his century mean the same thing as the Tamil poet a few centuries earlier? You can see 1,000 historical reasons why that might not be the case. But at some mystical level to say, thinking about God without thinking about the human race or thinking of all created beings doesn't really work. And you begin to realize, if I put them together as I have on the screen, the Tamil poetry is destabilized by reading it with Eckhart, and reading Eckhart is now changed by reading it with Tamil poetry. So that's another way to open it up, but it's a small way. You can also go and look at the full works of these authors, and I don't have something on the screen for this, but the work that I've started with is Tudor Marisai Peran's verses in honor of the 96 verses in the circle honoring Lord Narayana Vishnu, is by tradition one of his two works. And his other work is not in the same end-beginning style, Andadi style, but rather it's a work that is much more theologically organized. And the traditional commentators said, well, in the first work, he's training you, educating you to open your imagination, to get into the stories, to become part of this and make yourself part of it. And in the second work, he kind of sits back as a teacher and said, now let me instruct you on true religion. And the second work, which I won't go into at all tonight, is 120 verses, which fairly clearly goes through the transcendence of God, God in relation to the cosmos or the universe, God in the world, God in holy mythology, the avatars, God in temples, and God inside the self, and all along the way pointing out how this shows that other gods are really not gods. Now, somebody could argue and say, this doesn't seem to be the same kind of poet as the one who's writing this circle of verses that you go around again and again. But for 1,000 years, people have said, no, these verses, these two texts belong together. And I think that would be a third way in, not to think that they are poets and we are theologians, or they are lyric, emotional figures, and we're the ones who sit back and think, but to realize that, in fact, they think too. They theologize as well. Or one can go further and get into commentary. And I put this on the screen. Definitely we will not get into this. It's a page from the commentary for the text I began with. Today and tomorrow, and then a little longer, Your Grace is all I have, the text we began with. And what you have on the screen here, I'm sorry it's so small, up on the upper right side, you have the verse in Tamil. And then you have around it, as you might see in a rabbinic text, a series of commentaries. In this case, this edition, which I pulled off my shelf, one commentary from about 800 years ago, and then two commentaries from the 20th century. And they're explaining it, and they're not explaining it for foreigners. It's all in Tamil, with footnotes to explain the verses that are being quoted and so on. And this becomes a large path to follow. I mean, we know this from the Bible, be it the Hebrew Bible and the traditions of Mishnah, Talmud, and so on. But if you go into a library and see all the commentaries on the New Testament, ranging from the early church to the Middle Ages to modern times, you can realize, take a little book, any single book, let's say, of the New Testament, and realize that it opens up into thousands of years of interpretation and wisdom. The same thing can be done with the Tamil poetry. It kind of kills off the poetry in the process because you begin to forget the beauty of the poetry. But nonetheless, it's all possible. Another way that's a favorite way of mine, and I'll just tell you briefly about this, is that traditions in India, as I think in perhaps other parts of the world as well, begin to speculate on who the authors were. So I've mentioned these names to you, Andal, Tirumarisai Paran, Namalvar, and these stories about these saints. What is it that inspired them to write this poetry? Again, some of these hagiographies are very old, not the 1940s like one I mentioned earlier, but 1,000 years old. And so, for instance, the first three of the poets I mentioned, this Poigai Alvar, But Alvar, Pei Alvar, the three that wrote 100 verses each in this circular style, the beautiful story about them is that one of them it's a dark and rainy night, so that's a very common theme. A dark and rainy night, he goes into this wayside shed to escape the rain and be out of the rain until the storm stops. Then the second of these saints comes along and runs in and squeezes in there. He had been lying down, now there's only room for sitting, so the two of them sit side by side. And then the third one comes along and comes in, and now there's only room, so the three of them stand up. And this has to do also with temple iconography as well. But you go from one lying down to two sitting to three standing. And they're just waiting for the rain to stop. And suddenly they feel there is a fourth person in the room. And suddenly they realize, and this is again an 800-year-old story, suddenly they realize that the Lord has come and is squeezing in with them. And by tradition, the story that comes out is that suddenly the three of them broke into song. Each one has 100 verses, and the verses came pouring out of them. And they all sang their verses. I think devotees have said, well, it probably took 52 minutes or 48 minutes or whatever, but they're singing their verses side by side. And I think what they mean by this is that it's not really possible to imagine composing this, and you sit down and you have scraps of paper or whatever, you write it, then you add other verses in, and then you publish it a few years later, it all came flowing out as one. And so that you as a reader, you as a listener, you memorize it, and you are caught up in the flow. So stories like that, I think, deepen the sense of how this comes about. And there are stories about the other saints as well that I could point to. I alluded to just a moment ago another way of getting into the poetry, if we wanted to, and it's a question of who has the time or willingness to do it. But that, again, this poetry is not dead poetry. It's not 1,000-year-old poetry that is found in some manuscript and left and then brought out and published in the Morty Classical Library. But on the feast days of these saints, these verses are sung in the temple. And several of the works, like the 1102-verse work of Nam Alvar, which is the most important of these circular works, is sung twice a year, and 100 verses a day for 8 days, or I forget the math of it, 10 days, I guess, sorry. They work it out over time. But you can go to the temples on the feast days and you can hear the verses being sung. And then there'll be, on certain verses, like the woman Saint Andal, 30 verses in her most famous work, on the winter vow of the young women, 30 days in the winter month. She refers to the winter month at the first verse. There'll be 30 discourses, each day explaining a different verse. And then you get singers, both classical singers and popular singers, on YouTube, singing these verses and putting them out there, and people listen to them and so on like that. I remember one time with the poet I started with, Tirmarisai Piran, without me, Vishnu, Narayana, you are not. I learned only late in an afternoon, I was in Madras, that, oops, tonight is his festival at his temple. And I learned, I knew, but decided his temple is about 45 minutes from the bus station in the north of Madras. And if I take this bus, I'll get to the bus station. If I take that bus, I'll probably get there before it's over. And I did. I was young then. So I did all this. I went out to the temple. I get there. I'm the only foreigner within miles of this place. And they were exceedingly welcoming. They welcomed me in. They're singing the verses. They're sharing sweets and so on like that. And it ran on until the night. And it was one of the only nights in my life I've spent the whole night in a temple. When it ended, I'm sorry, the bus service has stopped. There's no buses until tomorrow sometime. So, but you can sleep over there, and here's a dhoti to put over yourself to keep warm. And I think that what kind of entrance into the materials is what we're being invited to do. And I think intuitively, those of us who are in Jewish or Christian tradition know the same, that you don't want people, give them a New Testament and say, good luck, do what you can with it. But invite people to worship, invite people into our celebrations, invite people into the way we live and celebrate our time together. And that somehow deepens it. And a kind of a sense of regret I have is that in some ways we're not doing this with the great treasures of the world. We can't, we don't, we won't, we don't have time. And yet it's all sort of there saying, if you want to, you can do this right now. Why wait? The final level of this, and I'll go quickly then because I want to finish in about 10 minutes, is a higher claim even where one of these saints, this Nam Alvar I've referred to a number of times, he goes further and says, well, who really is the author of the poetry I sing? The Lord has exalted me for all time. Day after day he has made me himself. And by me he now sings himself in sweet Tamil. My Lord, my first one, my abiding light, how can I sing of him? How can I sing of him, become one with my sweet life? He makes me sing sweet songs which I sing by my own words. By his own words, my wondrous one now praises himself. Though first among the three deities, he's always sung ahead of me. And the stupendous claim that he's making, if you have a theological mind, is that now the poet is saying, the verses that come out of my mouth are actually the verses of the Lord singing of himself. And that to hear these words is to hear the voice of God. To see these chosen words in Tamil is to suddenly hearing the verse of God itself, God singing. And that's not, these verses are about God or about religious experience, but to read this is God's own voice. It reminds me, and I'm by no means a scholar of Islam, some claims is that the Prophet Muhammad was not the author of the surahs of the Quran, but rather it was God speaking through him. And therefore just to hear them, even if you don't understand them, is to hear, in a sense, the eternal word. And I think that's something of what's going on here. Which leads me, finally, and I'll go quickly here for the last part, back to the problem of translating poetry. Because if you reach a point where you realize this poetry is alive, it's being celebrated, you can think it, you can comment on it, you can read it, you can study it, you can go to the festival, you can sleep overnight in the temple if you want, all of that you can do. It somehow has to do with the fact that the poetry itself is sacred and particular, and that poetry in itself is not replaceable by prose. Poetry, you can't get away by saying, oh, don't read the poems, I'll just tell you what I said. And so many times if you go to a poetry reading, the poet will not actually explain their poetry to you. They'll just read it to you and say, what, that's what I have to say. The poetry, I'm not going to give you a commentary on my poetry. And the sense that there's kind of a certain kind of sacramental intensity to it, that it is what it is. And just as we might say in Christian tradition, the Eucharist, the bread and the wine that are consecrated in many a Christian church, the meaning of it is not something you say about it or a theology about it, but for people who receive it, consume it, make it part of their lives, who worship, it all becomes intensely personal and irreplaceable. And I think there's something going on with poetry where after a while you can think it in all these strategies I've given you for learning how to deal with it, that actually living with it, reciting it, repeating it may be one of the best. I was thinking, the Psalms in the Bible, both in the Hebrew, the Jewish tradition, but also in the monasteries, in Christian tradition, or Sunday services, just endlessly going through the cycle of the Psalms and then starting again. And you go through them either in the Hebrew or Latin translation or English translation. And there's no progress. You just keep returning and going through the material again and again. In a section that I will leave out of the paper because I want to do one more thing before I stop, I use the theology of the Canadian theologian Terence Merrigan, who taught for many years at Leuven, about the sacramental encounter of religions among themselves. And that we tend to theorize, we tend to think about, we tend to conceptualize, but rather, in some sense, we have to realize that other religions are sacred places, sacred sites, sacred moments. And that as we, and he's a Catholic Christian, we in our tradition take the sacred very seriously and venerate it. We don't simply use it and misuse it, but rather we learn from it because it is sacred. We ourselves learn from the sacred in other traditions as well. And so he says in this passage, I'll just read you one short passage from his work before moving on, an incarnationally grounded and sacramentally oriented theology of religions cannot but pause and reflect upon the abundance of spiritual and moral goods manifest in non-Christian religious traditions. Such a theology is, so to speak, predicated on the conviction that lived religion is the only valid testimony to divine presence, and that where such testimony is given, one must tread carefully, for one may be standing on holy ground. And this changes the dynamic when we say it's not just a bunch of books in the library or pick and choose which ones you want to read, but the other that we study interreligiously is also sacred ground. He doesn't really say, but I thought of two texts that come to my mind, and I'm sure perhaps to your mind, when we hear the words about treading on sacred ground. The first text familiar from the book of Exodus, Moses approaches the burning bush and God says, throw off your shoes, you are on sacred ground. But I asked Terence Merrigan, weren't you referring to Christina Rossetti, her poem, A Later Life, where she says, tread softly, all the earth is holy ground. It may be, could we look with seeing eyes, this spot we stand on is a paradise, where dead have come to life and lost have been found. I thought that echoes this treading that he talks about. And he said, no, I didn't have that in mind at all. I think maybe in his subconscious he did, but it struck me. And if you think of this, our interreligious dealings with each other is not just words, or not just moral action, or not just virtue, but rather it's the ability to engage and learn because we are in the presence of the sacred. And I don't think you have to theorize this in terms of pluralism or relativism or anything, but rather when we venture, we are on pilgrimage. We are crossing over and we come back. To conclude, having thought about all of this, I'm thinking about where do we end up, and does it really matter in the world in which we live? And the final section, which I'll abbreviate greatly here, I'm thinking of how can we justify this in a world in suffering, a world where there are endless troubles around us. And I think of verses like Blake, Auguries of Innocence, to see a world in a grain of sand, a heaven in a wild flower, hold infinity in the palm of your hand and eternity in an hour. The beginning of this long, remarkable poem, Auguries of Innocence. And it's like a mystical passage. It could be one of the Tamil saints, an infinity in the palm of your hand. But if you read the whole poem, it's actually about animal rights. So he's writing this nearly 200 years ago, and he's talking about if you realize the sacredness of life around you, you realize that every individual, every being, every particular is sacred. And he rages on in this long work about we have no right to trash nature, we have no right to make animals suffer, we have no right even to eat them, but rather we have to realize that this is the sacred. And I think there's something powerful about that. But I close with one more quote. Years ago, when I was teaching Dorothy Day, founder of the Catholic Worker, soon I hope to be, I think many of us hope to be a saint of the Catholic Church. I saw an interview with her on TV in which she's talking about her work and all that, and at one point she pulls out a piece of paper and she said, I'd like to read to you this passage from William James. And I was amazed. Dorothy Worker reading William James, I think of this like heady Harvard professor, why is she reading William James? But she reads this passage, and I'll put this up on the screen. This is the last, the end here. She reads this and said, this passage has inspired me over the years. And having read the passage and studied it, I began to realize that James was at a point in his life when he was concerned about global capitalism, about the spread of transnationals even in his time period, and the way in which local cultures were being tramped on, overcome, eaten up in consumerism and capitalism, and the need to resist, that the things that are global and theoretical and explaining everything all at once need to be pushed back against. And I think there's something in this that I'd like to close with. I am against bigness and greatness in all their forms. And with the invisible molecular forces that work from individual to individual, stealing in through the crannies of the world like so many soft rootlets, or like the capillary oozing of water, and yet rendering the hardest monuments of man's pride if you give them time. The bigger the unit you deal with, the hollower, the more brutal, the more mendacious is the life lived. And so I am against all big organizations as such, national ones first and foremost, against all big successes and big results, and in favor of the eternal forces of truth, which always work in the individual and immediately unsuccessful way. Underdogs always, till history comes after they are long dead and puts them on top. Now it's a stretch, as I've explained this to several people quoting this. It makes me sound like a hero translating Tamil poetry because it's small and particular and pushing it back against the English language and kind of a global monoculture. But there's a way in which all the work we do and all the things we care about in individual are pushing back against the kind of monotonization of our cultures and our religions, where only the least common denominator matters. And somehow to have James's anger and his sense of confidence that if you go to the particular and you stay there, you actually will accomplish something in the long run, so that these individual verses and individual stories and individual saints can mean something if we stop and give them the time. And I've gone as long as I wish to go, so I think I will stop with that. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. I'm almost speechless, but not quite. I want to open up to the audience for just a few minutes. Any questions you might have, insights you might want to share. If it's an insight, briefly. If it's a question, briefly. So, the floor is open.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I just have a brief question about from whom is this coming from? So who are these poets? Who are they speaking to? So think of Indian caste society as one question. Is this a certain, strata of society? What about Dalits? What about the Brahmins? And then when you take this forward via Max Müller, you have the same problem again, right? Who is this written for? Who is Max ultimately producing this for? What's sort of the audience, and what can we learn from that? What's the implication? How can we use that for ourselves?
Yeah. I mean, the interesting thing about these poets, and I put up earlier that picture of the 12 of them, is that they're Tamil saints, not Sanskrit saints. And the range of them in Tamil culture, which often patriotically today pushes back and says, we're not the Sanskrit tradition, we're not the North Indian, is to see and say that these saints are diverse, 11 men and 1 woman, but diverse. There are several Brahmins, several of, you might say, the Kshatriya class, others like landowners and so on, but one is a Shudra, low class, and one is an untouchable, and then the woman saint. And so some diversity is brought in, and the point of it seems to be that if you are a devout person, if you have bhakti, if you have this love, then things like caste are external and do not matter. Whether they actually change society or not is a different issue. But why did they compose this poetry? As I quoted several times in there, if you read this poetry, you will be liberated. If you read this poetry, karma will end for you. If you end this poetry, you will have the poet's experience, which had the cowherd women's experience. It seems to be invitations in these elaborate poems, repeated again and again, that people in the community are to be drawn in to live this way. And it's definitely a non-evangelical tradition. So the Sri Vaishnava tradition, which is the name really for this, temples all over South India, temples now in the West, is one right near Boston and so on, are basically talking among themselves and cherishing and passing down this material. And they kind of stand up and look around amazed when people like me show up who read the poetry, read the Tamil and so on. But it seems to be basically, this is our treasure, this is our tradition. And it's for us. The translator, of course, says it's for everybody, but it begins by being for a few people. And they seem perfectly content. We'll just pass it on to our grandchildren and their grandchildren, and that'll be it.
Thank you so much. It's an insight / I want to know and hear a little bit about thinking about today as Christopher Columbus / Indigenous Peoples Day. And your question, right, like the academic constant question of why does this matter? I can't not help not think about the process of colonization and the demonizing of pluralism and polytheistic traditions. So in terms of ways that systemically we can see an overture towards these poems, these kinds of traditions being part and embraced, as I'm assuming the we is the one receiving the translation in English, Anglo culture. How did that, in terms of a systemic approach to what historically has been done to other cultures and other traditions, especially within what their holy grounds are?
Yeah, I mean, that's a perfect thing. And I probably should have mentioned, thinking of today as Indigenous Peoples Day, Columbus Day, the way in which on the one side, you have native peoples everywhere in the world who've been deprived, victimized, robbed, their cultures destroyed, their lives lost. When this kind of multinational enterprise of modern capitalism beginning in the colonial period spreads everywhere. Or like, environmentally, some foreign plant comes in and kills all the native plants and kind of spreads. Part of what it's trying to get at is that if we move to a generic level, even with good intentions about religious diversity, we all have a lot in common. All the particulars of all our traditions can be lost in this feel good or feel bad sense of religions. And therefore, how to go back and resist, as William James is asking specifically about, the international marketplace in his time and place. How can we go back and push back against that by returning to the particular? And I would just add that I think these saints of Tamil Nadu are in a middle ground. I don't work with Native American peoples or African traditional peoples or Australian Aboriginal peoples. And it's very, very sensitive about who gets to share their knowledge or who has a right or not a right to even listen in. These people, they write these poems in Tamil on the walls of the temple. For hundreds of years, they've been publishing them as books. They themselves have been doing so-so translations of them into English. And they sell them to me. They're delighted when I buy them. So I'm not like, Indiana Jones rushing into the temple and stealing things and taking off. I'm using the literature that they produce. And I think of it as a middle ground example. So it's not global in the sense of like a global spread of the gospel for everybody, or the Quran in every culture, or the Buddhist canon even in every culture, but rather local cultures that need to be heard and slow us down globally might be a way of saying, if we can preserve these and listen to them, perhaps when it comes to even more vulnerable local traditions, we'll realize that there especially we're treading on sacred ground and better take our shoes off before we go on the ground.
Thank you. Frank, one of the things that we do, imagine this is beautifully framed, is give our lecturers a framed print of your poster. So this will be framed and it will be sent to you, but it's simply the poster that you've seen both on the internet and around school. So I just wanted you to see it up close and personal. And it will be bigger.
That is gorgeous. I mean, I did see the versions online, but Krishna with his flute and the beautiful colors of the background, and so tastefully done. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. And thank you for spending a bit of time with us this evening. Please, there is food and drink for all. Through these doors, either one, hang a left.